Genesis 22 tells us that Elohim sought to test Avraham through telling him to ascend the mountain with his son and make a burnt offering. This dramatic event, just like many other events in the scripture, provides us with an opportunity to find symbolism. There are two kinds of symbolism that we might see throughout the scripture. One is explicit symbolism, and the other is inferred symbolism. If the symbolism is explicit, then we can use a plain reading of the text and see exactly how the text tells us what is going on. For example, the observance of Sukkoth represents how the sons of Israel were made to dwell in their departure in the Exodus, because it plainly says in Leviticus 23:43 that the observance causes remembrance of those events. Similarly, we might see how Exodus 4:22-23 makes the matter of freeing Israel a symbolic dispute between Elohim and Pharaoh over their firstborn sons. Elohim says his firstborn son is Yisrael, and that Pharaoh needs to free Elohim's firstborn son. Otherwise, Pharaoh will lose his son. And finally, we might look to some of the dreams that Joseph had, which are plainly treated as symbols when they are described in the text. These are examples of explicit symbols. On the other hand, we might consider inferred symbolism. Unlike the explicit symbols, these inferred symbols go beyond a plain reading of the text. They require us to assume something that is not said plainly, or require someone else to assume something and then tell us it's actually there. While these can be legitimate, there is a questionable aspect to this type of symbols, which involves our human nature. The fact is, as humans, we are geared to see validation. A part of our normal way of thinking is to find confirmation for our beliefs, regardless of where we look, regardless of the plain facts of a matter. Two people can have contradictory viewpoints and look at the exact same information, and then both can see validation at the same time. As an example, several years ago, I saw a news article about a church service. The church partially collapsed during the service. This collapse injured a few people, but no one died. These were the facts of the matter. However, we are inclined to see confirmation of our beliefs and to see symbolism. The pastor of this church said that it was proof that they were being protected because no one had been seriously injured. On the other hand, one person in the comments section of the article had a different take, that it was proof that the church's denomination was wrong because the collapse took place at all. Both of these people saw validation using similar information, even though the symbolism they saw was contradictory. This is the risk that we run into whenever we look for symbolism that is not plain and explicit. It doesn't automatically mean that it's not there, or it doesn't automatically mean that any confirmation we see is incorrect. But it should be a word of caution for us. We all have this inclination one way or another, and that also means that other people, like translators, can have that inclination. Certain words might be capitalized in a translation to incline us to think a certain way, which may or may not be legitimate. Likewise, certain wordings in a verse may be kind of fuzzied to lead us to think a particular way and to assume that a symbol that may not have been intended in the Hebrew is there. And once we've been geared to think a certain way about a passage, either because of how certain translations treat it or because of how later figures treat it, we get in the habit of automatically making those connections for ourselves and seeing that assumed symbolism unintentionally. It can actually be a big challenge for us to even be able to see that some symbols are not actually explicit or plain, because we have been geared to assume that these types of symbols are obvious, even when they're not. These are things that we need to be aware of with implicit symbolism. Now that we are considering that, let's go into some passages in Genesis 22. And it was after these matters, and the Elohim tested Avraham. From the beginning, we can see that this is supposed to be a test, that Elohim is going to see how Avraham responds. This is the context that Genesis places around this incident. Does Avraham truly fear Elohim? In verses 7 and 8, we see, And Yitzhak said to Avraham, his father, and said, My father. And he said, Behold me, my son. And he said, Behold the fire and the wood, and where is the flockling for the burnt offering? And Avraham said, Elohim shall see for him the flockling for the ascent offering, my son. Avraham and his son prepare to go and perform the sacrifice, and Yitzhak asks why they are not bringing a flockling with them. At this point, Avraham says that Elohim shall see for him the flockling. This is a slightly different wording from what we may have seen in some translations, like the King James Version. While the King James Version and other translations like it may be fairly close on this verse, we can see that fuzzying the wording just a little bit could allow for reading in some assumed symbolism with this verse, which we might not have assumed with a more literal translation. As the passage continues, And Avraham stretched his hand, and he took the knife to slay his son. Then in verse 12, the messenger stops him. And he said, You must not stretch your hand to the boy, and you must not do anything to him. For now I know that you are fearing Elohim. And Avraham lifted his eyes, and he saw, and behold, a ram behind, being caught in the thicket in his horns. And Avraham went, and he took the ram, and he brought him up for a burnt offering instead of his son. Avraham went ahead with preparing to offer his son, but was stopped from doing it. At this point, Avraham saw the ram caught by its horns. He sacrificed it instead of his son. There are a couple of things that I want to point out about this incident. We can see these by looking at the passage plainly. The first I already mentioned, which is what Genesis 22:1 says, that this represents a test of Avraham. The second is that the human sacrifice was stopped. There was no human sacrifice that took place. It was instead forbidden. The burnt offering of the animal took the place of it. If we look for a symbol regarding sacrificial practices in this passage, the plainer symbol is not that animal sacrifices are going to be replaced by human sacrifice, but that human sacrifice was ended in favor of animal sacrifice. And this symbol would fit with the commands of the Torah that we see given through Moshe, because human sacrifice is not a part of the Torah. Instead, the Torah commands animal sacrifices. In the scripture, we can see some explicit symbols. Symbols like in Exodus 4:22, the dispute over Elohim's firstborn, which is Yisrael. and Pharaoh's firstborn. We can also see inferred symbols, symbols that may or may not be intended to be seen there. The difference between these two is significant. With any situation of seeing symbolism, especially symbols that are inferred from the text rather than being explicit, we run the risk of seeing confirmation for pre-existing beliefs. This goes on for everyone to some degree, even when we try to guard against it. This is one reason I advocate for looking for the plain meaning, especially the plain meaning of the commands, and letting that take priority over any perceived symbolism. We know that we are not to add to the commands or take away from them. We know they are what is good and right in His sight. We know that they were established for the people to understand plainly. And we know that the Torah is what He set up for all of the days. His ways are for all of the days. Let us focus on the commands He gave us to serve Him through, His written Torah.